engage with us in the chat. And I would just love to introduce now Matt Gayer, who is the co-executive director at the Catalogue for Philanthropy. He has done so much to really build the learning commons there, which are all the amazing resources that they provide for nonprofits. So if you want to go ahead and take a look at that, I'm going to put the link in the chat as well, so you can access the amazing learning commons and resources that the Catalogue provides. So Matt, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me, and excited to talk about end of year, because somehow it is November, y'all, which still shocks me a little bit, but excited to dive into it. So give me 1 second here to share my screen. So when we think about, today we'll specifically talk about digital engagement at end of year. So we'll be focusing largely on kind of email and social, and how to craft that into a campaign overall. But we will touch on how the timing of your direct mail also matters for that. If you're doing a direct mail letter to your audience. So if you have any questions about that overall today, feel free to put it in the chat. And throughout, feel free to chat any questions. I'll answer those as they come up, but I'll also save a few minutes at the end to answer some questions as well. So for context, before we get into some really specific tips, first about email, then about social, then about the campaign overall, is that audiences right now going into end of year, we like to think of them as they're going to be very overwhelmed, but also very interested and engaged, right? So we are obviously, every end of year, we see it as a crowded space, a lot of group sharing, right? And that's just from the nonprofit sector. We also know there's a million other things going on for our audience this time of year. And obviously we're still in a very uncertain and kind of, crowded space just in the community with all the things that are changing constantly right now after the last 20 months of uncertainty. So we're going to see a heavy volume, but that actually means we need to be even more active. We'll talk about this a couple of times today. But it might seem like sometimes if my audience is inundated with messages, I should maybe take a step back, right, and have to overload them. But the opposite's actually true, right? If my audience is inundated with messages from everyone else, I need to also be sending a fair share to make sure I stay top of mind, right, and that they actually see it. We know that none of us actually read all the email we get. So it's important I'm sending enough of it, right? I'm posting enough that my audience actually connects with some of the things I'm actually putting out there. Secondly, we know that the audience is still invested, right? So overall giving is still up. Individual giving is still more elevated than it would have been based on trends from just back in 2019. So it's not as elevated as last year, but we still see people wanting to get involved, get engaged, help out in some way, feel like they're making a difference, right? Feel like they're connected to something. So it's a good time to try to get them engaged. It's a good time to ask both for financial support, which is obviously our main goal at end of year, but also to ask them to volunteer or share our message or things like that. And that final piece relates exactly to that. We need to keep in mind across our kind of email, social, digital communications at end of year, donor acquisition has been really hard for the last year and a half. During disaster-based fundraising, right, crisis fundraising like we've been doing, donors typically give to organizations they already know or organizations that are large enough that they've heard of before. So for small nonprofits, acquisition has been tough, but Giving Tuesday, end of year are great times to try to get people to do either informal or formal peer-to-peer campaigns. So trying to make sure our content is kind of shareable, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit today, but making sure what we're putting out there, folks would feel comfortable sharing with their own networks as well. So with that, we'll dive right in to some pretty kind of actionable tips and tricks, again, around email first, then social, and then putting them both together for your end of year campaign. So the first thing here we're thinking about with email is just thinking about what are the different factors, right, that are going to make my email more or less successful in the first place, right? So thinking about what metrics do I want to be tracking, what things can I change at different times. Ideally, we tested some of these things earlier in the year, right? So we kind of already know what works. If we haven't done that, we can also do this kind of testing or kind of tracking on the fly, right? And ultimately, if we're not doing it this end of year, we can prep for the next one. So some of the things that really are going to impact and the variables to think about if we haven't really thought through these before, the number one thing that actually impacts your open rates for your email is in the subject line. It's not the timing of it. Those two things are always things people ask about first, but it's actually who it comes from, the sender, right? So if we think about our own email inboxes, this is very possibly true that, if I get an email from someone I know, right, someone I respect, someone who I think sends out interesting content, I'm much more likely to open it. And secondarily, I'm probably looking at what the subject line says, right? If a friend of mine, if an organization I care about, if a brand that I buy stuff from emails me and I see that first, that's probably the first thing that's really getting me to open. So that sender is actually really important. There's no hard and fast rule for who this is, right? At the organization. I will say if there's not kind of one person who really is top of mind for donors, right? It can often be helpful that we're going to be sending enough emails across December to actually maybe change it up, right? So out of our 5, 6, 7 emails we're sending, maybe the majority are from our executive director, but at least one's from our program director, right? Or one's from our board chair or something. And obviously we're sending those, but we're just changing kind of who it says it's from. And the only real rule here around sender is we want it to come from a person. Psychologically, even though we don't really think about this, if you get an email from the Catalogue for Philanthropy, you might just ignore it, right? Because it's not, it's an organization, you can't offend an organization, so you don't feel as obligated to open it. If you get an email from Matt at the Catalogue for Philanthropy, even though, again, you may not consciously kind of think about this, you're more likely to open it because you're like, oh, that's technically from a person. Even though you likely know it's a blast, right? All those things are true. You're still more likely to open it if you put the name in there. So it's important we have a name and it's not coming from the organization. So we're thinking about who it's coming from. We're thinking about timing. This has really shifted during the pandemic with people working from home, right? There used to be pretty hard and fast rules on kind of the best times to send email to folks. And it was largely focused on the workday, right? And what they were doing. Now with some people working from home, some hybrid, some back in the office, it's a little more complicated. Generally speaking, we still know Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday are best for nonprofit emails. And typically we still see that morning time be pretty effective. But we're also seeing a lot more engagement around that lunch, early afternoon time, because I think people are looking to take a break a little bit in the middle of the day. So thinking about that as maybe an alternative time. And if you haven't tested that with your audience, maybe trying both at the end of year. Again, the majority of your emails in the morning, but maybe 1 or 2 of them going out early afternoon. Subject line, we'll talk about in a second, but again, does matter less than those first 2 points. It definitely is important. We'll talk about it, but also there's not really 100% great advice on what the subject lines should be, right? So we'll talk a little bit about some of the factors that make those more effective here in a second, but they're not kind of the silver bullet that a lot of folks think they are. And then in terms of style or theme, right, things like that, that's obviously going to impact your click-through, not your open rate, right? Because you already have to be in the email to even see it. But simple designs, right? It's not overly engineered. We don't want it to be too fancy, right? We see this in direct mail too. If the direct mail package we send is too nice, it actually decreases donations because people are like, wow, they spent that much on that. They obviously don't need my money. It's a little bit the same with email, right? If it gets too fancy, too kind of cutesy, right, with some of the graphics and stuff, people feel like, oh, that's like really professional. They're doing fine, right? This isn't as urgent. So just making sure it's clean, it's simple, there's some type of visual element, but nothing kind of over the top. Some of the things we want to track throughout our interview, and again, there's only so much we can really adjust when we're sending so many emails in a short amount of time. But obviously we're looking at open rates, we're looking at click-through rates, but also really important to look at unsubscribes as well, and tracking that and kind of getting a sense of how many people are opting out every time I'm sending something. That's going to help us also if that spikes, maybe get a sense of like, okay, maybe I sent too much this week, right? And allows me to kind of adjust the timing a bit, even in a short kind of 1 month period. And then finally, subject lines we'll talk more about here in a second. But the biggest thing is we want to communicate urgency, right? That's something you'll hear in pretty much every tip we have around the messaging. for our digital communications this end of year, we need a sense of urgency. We need people to kind of feel like they have to donate in the moment, because if they think they're going to come back to do it, they're going to forget, right? They have too much going on. So it's important we get them to make that choice right then and there. So speaking about subject lines, again, honestly, kind of no one knows exactly, right, what subject line is going to work. There's not kind of a formula for it out there. There's been some really great data on it. The best data actually has often come from political campaigns, who are obviously looking at this really closely, and how subject lines are impacting open and click-through rates. But some of the trends we see that make your subject line more helpful than less. One of those is to keep it really short, right? So recognizing the fact that the majority of email is read on smartphones now. So if you use a really clever, right, or really urgent, emotional, etc. subject line, but on phone, you're only going to see the first third of it, and it doesn't make any sense, right, or doesn't seem that interesting. Folks are never going to see the whole thing you wrote, right? So it's really important to kind of recognize how people are engaging with email now, and making sure we're writing subject lines that make sense for the way that they're engaging with it. Typically, in terms of kind of type of subject line, right, the structure of it, a question is often effective. Something with an ellipses, right, like read Jacob's story, ... That's a client impact story we're talking about. Something surprising, right, like BuzzFeed style, like 5 things you didn't know about local education, whatever that may be. All that probably sounds a little spammy to you, but why folks and why companies kind of use messages like that is because it works, right? They're spending a lot of money on this marketing and kind of the psychology behind it and stuff, and we can actually learn from those lessons a little bit. So we obviously want to be authentic to ourselves here, communicate in a way that we know our audience will respond to, but those types of subject lines we often see get the most engagement. The big thing is, especially as we're sending a lot of emails in a short amount of time, we don't want the same exact type of subject line every time. So I wouldn't want to send 7 question-based subject lines across the month of December. Always helpful to kind of pause and just think about the emails you're opening, right? So even in your own inbox, right, what promotional emails or nonprofit emails are you getting that you're opening, and thinking about why, right? Is it because it's who it's from? Because the subject line was interesting? Because the first line of the email was interesting, right? What's actually getting you to open it? And that's usually a pretty good barometer for what your audience is going to respond to as well. Again, keeping in mind that mobile friendly part, right? So thinking about load times, making sure it's not overly designed, so it still loads quickly. No one kind of waits for things to load anymore. And we want to make sure those subject lines are short enough that folks get the main point of it on their phone. And then as much as we can be, if we have recurring emails, being consistent, right? We want our end of year emails to stand out. So the more we can kind of separate things like our newsletter, right, or things like that, and making people be able to see what that is compared to our solicitation emails, we'll get a better response on our solicitation emails. All right, so when we're thinking about the content we're actually putting in there for end of year, we want to keep it to kind of 3 to 4 paragraphs at most, right? Folks are maybe going to read that much, probably not. So we want to keep it to that kind of the longest. We want to try to limit scrolling so people can kind of just engage with it quickly, not have to scroll down the page, because again, they often don't. And if it is going to be a longer email, right, or if you know they're going to have to scroll, especially if they view it on a phone because there's a picture in it or something, I want to make sure the call to action is at the very top of the email and also at the bottom. So we'll talk about this elsewhere as well, but if you're doing a fundraising email, right, where I'm asking people to give, I want to ask at least twice. I want to make sure one of those asks is at the top, right? So people can kind of quickly make that decision, and they'll also see it right from the beginning. We want to make sure that every email we send this end of year is active. So not every email we send might be a direct ask, right? So if I'm sending 7 emails across the month of December, maybe 4 or 5 of them have a direct appeal. Maybe 2 or 3 are actually more of a soft ask, right? Or a gratitude email, right, for those that have already given, or a progress on the campaign email or something like that. But we want to make sure that even in those soft ask ones, we're asking our audience to do something, right? We'll learn more about the issue here. It could be volunteer right? It could be go out in your community and do X, Y, or Z. We want to make sure that our audience is getting in the habit of when we email, they do something. And that's going to make it more likely, again, that when we ask for money, they're in that habit of responding to the email and actually doing something. And then finally, for the visual part of this, we do see that fundraising emails with a picture in it, right, or a short embedded video perform better than those without. We just want to make sure, again, this doesn't slow down the email loading. The content stands alone in case the picture doesn't load, right? And adding a caption at the bottom of the picture, again, in case it doesn't load. In terms of what we see audiences really kind of engaging with right now, the biggest thing is that audiences want to feel a personal connection, right? So folks still feel disconnected. They still aren't back 100% to their typical routines necessarily. So they want to feel that personal connection to the work and to the team overall. So any type of short anecdotes or stories we can include there are going to be helpful. And the more we can personalize the addressing of the email to them, right? So mail merging their name. If we're segmenting the audience and we're able to talk a little bit about, hey, like this group of my audience went to our annual event this year, so I'm going to include a mention that they attended the event, right? The more I make it feel like it's to them, the better they're going to engage with it. I want to make sure that there's, again, that sense of urgency, because we know a lot of people are going to be asking for support for a lot of really important work. So we want to make sure we're really elevating a sense of urgency. We need you to support today. We're looking to hit this goal this week. We have a matching gift, the first half of today, right? Why Giving Tuesday is so effective is the urgency behind it. So it's really important we're driving that urgency across the whole month. People really feel like they need to act in the moment. And then finally, we need to be really specific when we're describing our work right now. Many donors are still wondering what our work looks like, right? Everyone kind of asks, hey, are you in person? Are you still virtual? Are you hybrid? What does that look like, right? How's it different than it was in February of 2020? So it's important that donors aren't going to support at a high level our work. They don't really understand what we're doing. So we have to be a little more specific than we probably used to be. For many of us, our programs probably felt kind of self-explanatory before in a lot of ways. And now we probably have to explain them a bit more than we used to. So it's important we're kind of saving space in our messaging for that. Then finally, for the solicitation itself, in our emails at end of year, again, early on in the email at the top, we want to make sure it's clear that it's a fundraising email and that there's an ask at the top. Part of this is that some people know they're going to donate to you, so they don't want to read the whole email. They just want to click the link, right, and give, which is awesome. We also want folks to not be surprised, right? So they're reading this beautiful client story we're sharing, then all of a sudden we're asking for money, right? That can feel like a hard transition. The final thing is just like we would for a donor in person, we would probably tell them, hey, next time we get together for lunch, right, for a major donor, I want to talk about your fundraising for this year. It allows them to psychologically prepare and think ahead of time about how they want to support, even in the short amount of time it takes to read an email. That actually makes a donor more likely to respond to that second ask at the bottom if while reading the email, they knew it was a fundraising ask. Right. So in the back of their mind for those 5 seconds, 10 seconds of reading through the email till they get to that solicitation at the bottom, they've been thinking about supporting you. It makes them more likely to say yes because they're not caught off guard. So again, we want to have at least those 2 links to donate, probably not more than 3. So 2 to 3 links there to donate. So easy access in the email. We want to make sure it's a hard ask. So, we want to stay away from soft ask and emails of, we hope you'll decide to support this work. We need to be more specifically, we would like you to donate today to help preserve X, Y, or Z. So we need to make sure we're having that hard ask where we're actually specifically saying we want them to give money and we want them to give it soon. And then finally, we want to, in most of our emails, or at least some of our end of year emails, include gratitude for their past support, right? Or gratitude for our donors overall, if we have a mix of prospects and donors in our email list. We want to make sure we're driving home that message that we appreciate donors before they even make the donation. So I'm going to switch gears here in a second to social media, but any questions about email at end of year before we switch over? Someone messaged me and was asking about how many emails. We're going to talk about timing, kind of campaign structure here in a little bit after social media. So we'll get to that kind of frequency and that timing in just a few minutes. All right, so switching over to social media, a similar message in terms of this first piece as it is with email is that more than we think is necessary will be helpful, right? So a higher volume of social posting is actually going to help. Our audience isn't going to be overwhelmed by it. A big thing to keep in mind is that even if we're posting a lot, right? So when we talk about Giving Tuesday, for instance, we're encouraging people to post, 5 times, if not more. And we'll talk about that in a second. Our audience isn't going to see all 5 or 10 posts, right? With the way algorithms are and just the volume of content and how people engage on social, they're maybe going to see a handful of those in most cases, right? So we need to post more often than we think in order to kind of create that visibility for our audience. So a couple of things here in terms of kind of volume or scope of our social media towards end of year this year. In terms of where we should be posting, right? What kind of platforms or accounts. This is a good time to stay active on the ones we're already active on, right? So audience is going to be hard to kind of acquire right now, right? Because there's going to be so much volume. They're going to be engaging with what they already know. So not the time to kind of launch our Twitter effort, right? Or begin to post on Instagram. If we have a really strong Facebook presence, we should stay on Facebook. Really strong Insta, stay on Insta. But make sure we're kind of using the platforms we already have versus trying something new right now. That's a good thing to start maybe in January or February, but not at end of year. We want to deprioritize anything we kind of sparingly use or don't have good engagement. So again, if we have low capacity, we know for our partners, only about half have development staff and only about 20% have a comms person. So if you're kind of doing this on the side, right, you don't have a ton of capacity or time for it, prioritizing the 1 or 2 you're really strong on is fine. Right. So ultimately, if I can only post on Facebook and Instagram and I don't have time to really focus on my Twitter strategy, or if I'm just reposting content from Facebook to Twitter quickly, totally fine. Right. It's really important we focus on where the audience is and where we have that audience pre-existing. For Giving Tuesday itself, for social media, as we think about Giving Tuesday as part of our kind of end of year fundraising efforts, really encouraging folks to at least post 5 times that day, if not many more, right? And this is 5 times on any one platform, again, if not more. And that, often will sound, especially to folks that have a small comms team, as a lot. But when you think about, a kickoff post, right? A thank you post at the end of the day, and then kind of 3 engagement posts during the middle with maybe, a couple stories about the work, right? Or gratitude about our progress so far, right? Or hey, we're almost at our goal type post. We very quickly are at 5 or 7 across the day. So it's really important we're thinking about that. And again, our audience isn't going to see every single post we make. So it's important we're getting those out there. And then finally, when we're thinking about kind of social media across December, again, at a high level kind of scope wise, we want to get as close to a daily post as possible, right? Monday through Friday. And even if we can't get there, right, setting a goal of, hey, we're going to post 3 times a week and creating a rhythm, right? On Mondays, we post this type of post. And on Tuesdays, we usually make an ask. And on Wednesdays, we thank our donors. But getting in a rhythm across the month is going to make our audience more engaged with it, right? They kind of know what to expect. And we see that kind of increases engagement, especially during those last couple of weeks that are so busy. And we should definitely backload our posts. So if we don't have enough content, right, if we don't have enough time or enough visuals to really post every day during the month, making sure we can post every day those last 2 weeks is really important, or even more than that last week. Sorry about that. Second tip here is something we see that can really be helpful for both Giving Tuesday and end of year for social media, which is that making sure it's not just us sharing our message, right? So the more we can get other folks to share our message as well, the more engagement that's going to cause. So thinking about, is there a group of kind of 10 to 12, 10 to 15 volunteers, donors, board members, staff who are could agree to share our message ahead of time? and help us kind of increase our visibility. So this isn't broadly, so they're not just going to share kind of whenever they kind of want to. We really want to get this group organized to actually all share roughly at the same time, a couple times during our end of year campaign. So for instance, we often advise this as a really great Giving Tuesday strategy. So getting 10 or 12 folks to share a message at the beginning of the day is actually one way to kind of get around the algorithms and increase our visibility for the rest of our posts that day. And obviously also creates a sense of kind of bandwagon effect, right? A lot's going on. People are talking about the organization. It makes it more likely that other folks are going to want to get involved with it. So even that small group can really improve our visibility. So we could use that at the beginning of Giving Tuesday. We could use that for coordinated effort towards the end of December. But the small group can actually make a really big difference for our social. And when engaging, kind of working with them, we want to think about making sure to give them templates, right, for both the text of the post and also the images to use. Encourage them to personalize, right? They obviously want to make it feel like it's part of their personal brand, but we want the overall message to kind of stay consistent. We want to make it simple for them, right, and really straightforward. In terms of kind of when to do this, when to organize this group, earlier in the day is better because we're going to get those visibility benefits across the day. But if we're doing it later in the day, just make sure it's coordinated, right? The tighter that timing is, the more that they're all posting between 9 and 9:05 a.m. Instead of kind of 9, 9:30, and 10, the more kind of engagement it's going to get for us. The third tip here around kind of our messaging and our content for social at end of year is that it can't just be solicitation, right? So we know overall social media is not a great fundraising platform in a lot of cases. It's a great engagement platform. So at end of year, we're definitely using it for fundraising. We're definitely gonna have ask on there, but trying to keep our ask to kind of 1 or 2 times a week. And especially, maybe the second half of December, more like 2 or 3 times a week, but also using it to do some of these other things as well. So some of these complementary things, and as we talk about multi-channel marketing here in a second, it'll become even clearer about why, because we're asking elsewhere. So we don't always need to be asking on social. But some of the things we can do to support our solicitation efforts on social media this end of year. One is using social to show gratitude. We don't see enough organizations think about thanking donors, and this can be donors kind of broadly. It doesn't have to be individuals you're calling out, although it could be. But using social media to show gratitude, right? Couldn't do this work without the support of donors like you, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But being able to kind of create that, gracious and kind of gratitude sense for donors on our social is going to make them more likely to give because they have a sense of that, okay, if I give, I'm going to be appreciated, right? And my gift is going to matter to the organization. Secondly, we can use this to show progress on the campaign. So if we have a goal that people are excited about, right? If we raise $50,000, we're going to be able to launch a new program, right? We're going to be in 2 more schools. We're going to be doing X, Y, or Z. Being able to show progress on that goal and how close we are to the campaign is going to make people feel like they want to participate. It's also going to make them feel like others in the community already are. They don't want to be left out. So again, kind of bandwagon effect. They're going to be more likely to join in. And then finally, obviously, we want to use social media a lot at the end of the year to tell our story of impact. So using client stories, using stats to really highlight both the need and also difference our work is making. And that's a story we really want to make sure we're telling on a regular basis at the end of year to kind of complement the solicitation and appeal that we're making elsewhere. Then in terms of how to kind of get ready for this, right, which I know we're already kind of in end of year, but as we prep, especially for December, which we know is kind of the busiest part of the end of the year season, we want to kind of get ahead of our social media as much as possible. Again, for any of us with small teams, right, non-dedicated communications people, it's hard to just kind of make this up on the fly. So the more we can plan ahead, the better. So especially for visuals, we know visuals this year for organizations is really tough. We're going on kind of 2 years of possibly not having in-person programming, so we probably have less photos than we typically would. So it's important to kind of pre-plan for our visual content in terms of graphics and pictures, keeping it simple, right? If we're kind of making graphics for social or stuff, and not forgetting to include video if at all possible. So again, I know a lot of us may not have great video content or right now because of how our program has been. But the more we can pre-plan that, gather that ahead of time, the better. Thinking ahead of time about who's going to be monitoring social, it's really important end of year we're not just posting, but we're communicating with our audience, right? So as they're commenting and sharing and liking, etc., we're also responding to that. So thinking ahead of time about who that's going to be. Do we need to have a kind of committee that's doing it? Are we rotating folks every day that are doing it because we don't have the staff time to have one person responsible for it? But it's important that probably more so than any other time of the year, we have that active presence. And thinking about, we do see the best engagement still right now is with any type of live video, right? So going live on Instagram, Facebook, etc., is going to get you the most engagement. So thinking about, can we plan ahead a very simple, update from our executive director, right? This is also a great time to do something short and thank our donors, right? And use that as a gratitude post. And then finally, scheduling this ahead of time. If we need to use a scheduling app, we definitely can. Sometimes the flexibility of doing it kind of more in the moment, or we just don't have time to actually pre-schedule all of them, which is totally fine. But at least having a plan for, okay, again, on Mondays, we post this type of content, and here's what we're thinking about for Mondays in December. On Tuesdays, we do this. Here's what we're thinking about for Tuesdays. The more we can get in that kind of rhythm and that schedule, the easier it'll be for us, and also the more engaging it'll be for our audience. So with that, I'm going to switch to end of year tips. We'll go through this, and then I'll pause for questions here in just a few minutes. So first of this is that we really want to make sure we're doing this from a kind of a multi-channel perspective, right? So not thinking about our social in a vacuum, separately our email, separately we're doing a direct mail campaign, separately we're trying to get people engaged on our website, et cetera. We want to make sure we're actually thinking about all those as one marketing effort, and those are just different channels that we're using. So in general, multi-channel marketing, right, where our audience is getting asked on different platforms and different kind of structures, is going to be the most effective. Part of this is the fact that it's easier for audiences to remember. Their retention of a message is much higher if they see it on Facebook and they get an email about it, even more so if they also get a direct mail letter. So it's really important we're thinking about how do we make sure we get to the same audience in multiple ways. The message itself is going to be consistent, right? So we want that theme for end of year, right? The focus of our end of year to stay true across all those platforms, but obviously shift tone and style as needed to work for the platform we're sending it on. And then in terms of timing overall, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second as well. For Giving Tuesday, we're thinking, 2 to 4 emails, right? Between some before day emails and day of emails, 5 to 12 social media posts on the day of. And then for December, really trying to get to that daily post, if not even more so at the end of the month, and a minimum of 5 emails, right? So basically a weekly end of year email, and then maybe a bonus one that last day of year. We do really see giving that last day of year incredibly elevated. So it's important we're getting our email out there that last day as well. We want to make sure we're getting our message, again, across all these platforms, but saying it multiple times. This is why we keep a consistent message. Our audience needs to engage with the idea 7 to 9 times before they really kind of buy into it. So it's important we're using a lot of repetition here. For direct mail, we do see direct mail still performing generally well. People often want that break from digital, and especially if we have audiences that are that elder millennial Gen X, right? So kind of mid 30s to kind of late 40s. That audience actually wants to give online, right? Because like they have a checkbook, but they don't really know where it is. But they actually respond best to direct mail. These are folks that still want a book instead of a Kindle, right? So that can be a really nice kind of personal touch to send a direct mail thing to an audience who's also getting an email solicitation. They'll more likely give across the email, but the direct mail is actually going to be a big push to get them going in the right direction. For email, again, kind of minimum of 5, right? It's a 4 to 6 number. On the low end across December, we can definitely go higher than this. But especially for the first couple weeks of December, we don't want to totally overwhelm our audience. So thinking about kind of weekly emails until we get to that kind of final week or 2 of the month. We want each email to stand on its own, right? Because there's a good chance folks are not going to read all 5 or 6 that we're sending across the month. But if they do read all 5 or 6, we don't want them to be completely just copies of each other, right? So we want a narrative across all 5 or 6, but any one of them would drive people to give. And then for social, again, we know engagement's still high overall, right? People are still on the platforms more than they ever have been. So we want to keep those asks though to kind of 1 or 2 times, maybe 2 to 3 times towards the end of December. And the rest of the time, again, use it for gratitude, use it for information, use it for showing impact. We want to think about how we're connecting with our audience kind of narratively. We really see stories matter a lot right now to donors. And the thing, and this is always kind of true, but even more so over the last kind of year, is that donors are really responding most to individual client stories. So the more we can show we made a difference in 2021 on an individual basis, the more connected our donors are going to feel and the more likely it is that they're going to give during this end of year. It doesn't always have to just be client stories. We may have a hard time surfacing those again if we have largely virtual programs right now. So it also can be staff perspective, right? What was it like to be a program staff this year? What were some of your favorite highlights, right? Things like that. So if you want to change a pace email, a board member or staff member's perspective can often be a good thing to throw in one of our end of year emails. We want to talk a little bit about the process. So as we shared earlier, donors are wondering what our work looks like these days. So it's important we're sharing some type of story or narrative that works through how we're doing the work we're doing right now. And we want to make sure, again, we're providing that context because it is a little bit more opaque or mysterious about how we're delivering services. So we want to make sure donors understand that. Then finally, when we're thinking about timing, we're thinking about the order of kind of these multiple channels we're using at end of year. So email, right, is going to be our best kind of kickoff campaign, right? So if we haven't announced our end of year campaign yet, we're probably getting ready to do so. And we want to do that over email. And again, each email we send across end of year from now through December 31st, we want it to stand on its own. But as a collection, we want it to build on each other, right? So we want those impact stories to relate to each other, the stats we share, the calls to action we have, all the kind of, again, go hand in hand. We want to think about for direct mail, this is a great thing to send that kind of second or third week of December. A lot of organizations send 2, right? So they send it earlier in November and also again in December. Some organizations do send it earlier than this, but we really see people making those giving choices that second week and on in December. So we want to get it there early enough that they have some time to think about it. It also doesn't get lost in all the holiday mail and stuff. But we do want to make sure that we're getting it there when they're actually making that giving choice, and a follow-up to our email, right, as a multi-channel approach. And then finally for social, right, this is happening throughout. It's going to support both of those and add context. And again, really thinking about our social media, adding more stories, more stats, more color to what we're doing that we can easily include in the simple messages we're putting on our email or direct mail. So with that, I'm just going to cover a couple of quick next steps, then pause for any questions that folks have. So a couple of things to kind of do now, right? Because there's obviously a lot of things we talked about that you could do across your end of year. Thinking most about what your audience is going to respond to. What has your audience been responding to for the last few months? How can we double down on that? Thinking about the ask we're going to make, right? How are we doing that appeal and what info? I know you all are going to be talking about that later today. So really deciding that and diving into that early. Getting those visuals together sooner than later, because we know, again, it's harder this year than usual. So I want to make sure we're thinking ahead of time about that. That we're not just asking this giving season, but also showing gratitude as well. It's going to make donors more likely to give or give again if they already have given. Thinking about those multiple channels and how we make sure the brand and the message is staying consistent across all of them. And then finally, making sure we take time to look at the data at the end of the campaign, right? This is a January task, but we want to make sure we're thinking about how we're capturing that data now and then looking at it in January. So we're that much better positioned for 2022, because they'll be here sooner than any of us care to think. So with that, I'll pause and take any questions you all have in the chat.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. This has been so great. You covered so many great topics on communications, and I think this is so valuable. So thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I would love to open it up. Anyone that has any questions for Matt, or any challenges, like what what challenges do you face when it comes to standing out at year end? And we could have a few minutes to chat through them. But yeah, Matt, I love the idea of really having that. And we've talked about this a little bit. We had a session on direct mail yesterday too. But like having that like direct mail be like kind of alongside email to, push those donations. Laura said, we plan to use a story in direct mail. What are your thoughts about breaking that story up and using on social?
Yeah, so that's a great example of kind of having that consistent message across platforms. So I think breaking that up across social, we've seen people do that also with their emails as well. So sending that story in their direct mail and then using versions of it in their email campaigns. So I think a great idea to kind of share that story, and especially on social, you then can easily link right to more information about, here's a story and here's how it relates to our annual report, right? You can link it to
Yeah.
other stuff. So definitely someone we would recommend. So it's a great idea.
Absolutely. And if you have the opportunity, I don't know if you do, but if you can get it on multiple mediums, like the same story written and then the same story on video and then like having that and even just like photo or multiple photos, that could be really fun to like tie that story together and different methods of storytelling too. Cool. Any other like I guess hurdles when it comes to your year end? Chad said, FYI, as I was listening yesterday, I came up with the idea for a year end story. Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad that some of this is hopefully giving you guys tons of ideas. That's the hope. So awesome. I'm excited. I think you're a VIP, so I'm excited to hear more about that in our uh fundraising appeal session later. Laura asked, if you don't have the capacity to post multiple times a week, what do you think are the most important things to post? Ask, gratitude, etc.
Yeah, so I would think still about it narratively across the month, right? So if I know I only have capacity to make 5 posts, 10 posts, whatever it is, whatever I have time for, kind of space for, I would make sure I touch on a few of those things, right? So obviously towards the end of December, my post, however many I do, are going to be more about solicitation and about asking. Uh, Earlier in the month, probably a mix of gratitude and impact. But if that means I have to post weekly, right? And my first post in December is about impact, my second about gratitude, my third about impact, and my last two about solicitation. Again, it's about doing what we have time for, right? Kind of making it work for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's like roughly that like 80-20 rule, but I actually think like towards the end of the year, you can kind of which 80% should be just like storytelling and all of that. But I think like every post, even if it's not a hard call to action, there should still be the link back to wherever people can donate.
Yeah, definitely on the
Yeah,
link. 100% agreed. That soft ash should be ever present those last 10 days of the month for sure.
yeah, definitely. Cool. All right. I think that's our questions, unless anyone else has some more. I know everyone is probably a little sleepy still. We went all day yesterday. We started at 9, we ended at like maybe like 6:30 with the happy hour and everything. So long day. But Matt, I so appreciate you being here. This has been such great content. Thank you so much for sharing. I really encourage everyone to check out Catalog for Philanthropy's amazing resources. I'm gonna paste the link in the chat again, so you can go take a look at that. So, as I wanted to share a little bit more, so you have some context. So the Catalog of Philanthropy is a small nonprofit for small nonprofits. nonprofits. And they offer an annual digital membership to our virtual capacity building services, which includes 80 plus live webinars and a resource portal with 200 plus tools, templates, and videos. It's designed to be actionable and realistic, and their professional development and tools are made with small nonprofits in mind. So go ahead and take a look at those resources. There's going to be a lot of great things that you can continue to engage with, especially as we head into end of the year. So I know there's still more questions that are going to come up, and especially as we get closer, there's a lot of different strategies you can take to really optimize your fundraising this year. And they have incredible tools built with you in mind as a small nonprofit. So yeah, thanks, Matt. It's always so much fun having you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank
Um,
you for having me, and
Zach,
good luck for the rest of the day.
thanks so much. Yeah, this is great. Okay, great. Well, thank you again for being a partner with us too. So
Yeah,
appreciate it.
have a good one.